Poker nights were sacred. It was the one time of the week I didn't have to think about work, chores, or anything other than the cards in my hand and the banter around the table. My friends and I had been doing this for years, always at my place since it had the biggest basement. Jessica usually stayed out of sight, giving us space, though she'd occasionally pop her head in to say hi or bring us snacks. This night felt no different at first. The familiar smell of stale beer, laughter, and shuffling cards filled the room. I just won around, pocketing the chips with a grin, when Jessica came down the stairs holding a tray of drinks. Her smile was bright as she set them down, her eyes meeting mine in a way that felt strangely intense. I chalked it up to the fact that we hadn't spent much time together lately, both caught up in work. Maybe she was just happy to see me unwind. But then, she didn't leave. Instead, Jessica lingered at the edge of the table, watching us play, even commenting on a few hands. My friends nudged each other and shot me glances, surprised by her sudden interest. Normally, she couldn't stand poker, calling it a silly way to waste an evening. When I asked if she wanted to join in as a joke, she laughed and shook her head. "Not my thing," she replied, flashing a grin. As the night wore on, we all became a bit tipsy, the laughs louder, the bets higher. And then it happened, a bet that changed everything. It started as a joke. Jessica had been egging on Tom, one of my friends, telling him he couldn't bluff his way out of a paper bag. He grinned, playing along, and before I knew it, she made a suggestion, a dare, really. If Tom lost the hand, he'd have to, what was it she said? Yes. He'd have to wear a ridiculous hat she had upstairs, something she claimed would add some class to his poker face. But if he won? She grinned, saying, "Well, if you win, maybe I'll buy you a drink sometime." I remember feeling a strange prickling in my chest, like something was off, but I brushed it aside, thinking she was just teasing. Everyone laughed, and I forced a chuckle, though something about it didn't sit right. She'd never spoken to my friends like that before, especially not Tom, who'd always been a bit of a flirt. Tom took the bait, his eyes twinkling with excitement. The game continued, but my mind was barely on the cards. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I couldn't quite name. The atmosphere grew tense, almost electric, and I caught Jessica glancing at me, an unreadable expression in her eyes. Then, Tom won the hand. And that's when the dare took a turn, when Jessica suggested, half laughing, half serious, that she'd up the stakes. She leaned in close to Tom, whispering something I couldn't hear, her lips curved in a smile that wasn't meant for me. As Jessica whispered to Tom, the air in the room grew thick. I couldn't hear what she said, but the look on his face, somewhere between surprised and intrigued, set my nerves on edge. He looked back at me, almost sheepish, but I could see the excitement glinting in his eyes. "All right, Jess, you're on," Tom said, his voice louder than usual, making everyone look up. My heart dropped at his casual use of her nickname. Only close friends called her that, and Tom wasn't close enough, at least, I didn't think so. The guys around the table exchanged glances, some of them chuckling, probably thinking it was harmless. But to me, it felt anything but. Jessica laughed and gave him a playful nudge, and the rest of them joined in, feeding off her energy. I wanted to say something, maybe pull her aside and ask what the hell was going on, but I didn't want to make a scene. I told myself it was just harmless fun, maybe this was her way of trying to be one of the guys, for a night. But the look in her eyes said otherwise. The game continued, though I could hardly keep my focus. My mind raced, questions tumbling over one another. When did she start being so friendly with Tom? Had I missed something? I remembered small moments, the way she'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, or how she sometimes mentioned running into him at the grocery store. I'd brushed it off as coincidence. We all had overlapping routines, after all. But now, those tiny moments seemed to take on a different shade. As the game went on, I could feel the stakes inching higher. It wasn't just about the chips on the table anymore. Jessica was engaged, watching each hand unfold with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When Tom won a big pot, she clapped a little too enthusiastically, giving him a wink that made my stomach turn. It felt as if I was watching something unravel right in front of me, yet I was powerless to stop it. Then, another dare came up, this time between the two of them. Tom, clearly emboldened by Jessica's earlier dare, looked her straight in the eye and said, "If I win this hand, you have to give me a kiss." The table went silent. The laughter died, replaced by a tension so thick you could slice through it. I could feel my jaw clench, my hands gripping the edge of the table. I expected Jessica to laugh it off, to brush it aside and remind him that she was, after all, my wife. But instead, she just smiled, a slow, teasing smile that didn't look like hers at all. "All right," she said, leaning back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "But only if you win this hand." The room seemed to shrink, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of every heartbeat, every shallow breath I took. My friends looked at me, waiting for my reaction, and I managed a strained smile, hoping to play it off. But inside, a storm was brewing. This wasn't harmless anymore. This was something else, something darker and far more dangerous. The cards were dealt, and each flip seemed like a countdown, ticking closer to a moment I wasn't sure I wanted to see. I watched Tom's face, his smirk widening as he looked down at his hand. I couldn't tell if he was bluffing or if he actually had a winning hand. But Jessica, she was watching him like he was the only one in the room. When the final card hit the table, Tom let out a triumphant shout. "Yes," he yelled, reaching across the table toward Jessica. She looked at me, just for a split second, before leaning in to give him a quick peck on the cheek. Everyone burst into laughter, as if it were some innocent joke, but I could barely hold on to my composure. That kiss, however brief, felt like a betrayal, a crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about us. And the worst part? Jessica didn't seem the least bit sorry. She grinned, looking around the table, as if she'd just won a game herself. But for me, this was no game. This was something I couldn't just laugh off or brush aside. After that kiss, something inside me shifted, as if a lock had snapped open, flooding me with doubts I hadn't allowed myself to entertain before. Jessica was laughing with my friends, her face flushed from the attention. I watched her, feeling like I was on the outside looking in, watching my own life as a stranger might. When the next round started, Jessica didn't leave. She stayed by Tom, her hand resting on his shoulder as if it belonged there. He threw an arm around her waist in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to focus on my cards, but every glance in their direction felt like a gut punch. I couldn't recognize the woman at my side, the one who seemed to have forgotten who she was, or worse, who I was. Tom leaned over and whispered something to Jessica, and she let out a giggle that was too loud, too bright. The others chuckled, but I felt a flush of anger crawl up my spine. My mind was a whirlwind, thoughts spiraling out of control. Was this really happening? Had I missed signs, ignored warnings I should have heeded? I tried to tell myself it was all a joke, that Jessica was only playing along, but the truth was hard to deny. There was something different in the way she looked at him, something that went beyond harmless flirting. I realized, in a wave of bitter clarity, that I didn't know how long this had been going on, if it was just tonight, or if there were other moments, other secrets I hadn't seen. A part of me wanted to stop the game, to pull Jessica aside and demand an explanation, but pride held me back. I didn't want to give her, or Tom, or anyone else, the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. So I sat there, pretending that none of this mattered, when in reality, it was tearing me apart. Tom threw in a big bet, and Jessica clapped her hands, urging him on, practically cheering. Her voice sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't stand it any longer. "Jessica, why don't you give us a minute?" I said, trying to keep my tone light, but I could hear the edge in my voice. She looked at me, her smile faltering just for a second before she covered it up with a laugh. "Oh, come on, it's just a game," she said, brushing off my words with a wave of her hand. Lighten up a little. But it wasn't just a game. It was our marriage, our trust, our life. I tried to catch her eye, hoping to communicate how serious this was to me, but she was already turning back to Tom, her hand on his shoulder again as if she hadn't heard a word I'd said. The game continued, but I was only half there, watching as Jessica and Tom shared whispered jokes and secret smiles. Each laugh, each shared glance, felt like a fresh wound, slicing deeper than the last. I knew my friends were aware of the tension, too. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting glances in my direction, but no one said a word. Finally, the night drew to a close. One by one, my friends said their goodbyes, patting me on the shoulder, giving me sympathetic looks that only deepened the sense of betrayal gnawing at my insides. Tom was the last to leave, and as he walked out, he turned to Jessica, winking. "Catch you later," he said, a casual phrase that felt anything but casual. Jessica closed the door behind him and turned to me, still wearing that same bright, careless smile. "What?" she asked, shrugging as if nothing unusual had happened. Her eyes were clear, defiant, daring me to say something. And for the first time in years, I couldn't find the words to respond. There were too many questions, too much anger, and I was afraid of what might spill out if I let myself start. "Nothing," I said finally, the word hollow even to my own ears. I turned away, heading upstairs without another glance back. I didn't want her to see the hurt in my eyes, the sense of betrayal that was beginning to harden into something colder, something sharper. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the silence between us felt heavier than anything we could have said. And in that silence, one thought kept echoing: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur. Jessica and I barely spoke, each of us walking around the house as if the other didn't exist. She seemed unfazed, even cheerful, as if nothing had happened, as if her antics on poker night were already forgotten. But for me, it was as if a shadow had settled over everything. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded of the way she'd looked at Tom, how easily she dismissed my feelings in front of our friends. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe I was overreacting. But then I'd remember the kiss, the whispers, the shared smiles, and it would all come flooding back, that sense of betrayal as sharp as ever. A week passed before I found the nerve to confront her. One evening, as she was putting away dishes, I walked into the kitchen, my chest tight with the words I'd been holding in. "Jessica, we need to talk." She looked up, mildly surprised, as if she'd forgotten that night completely. "About what?" "About poker night," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "About what happened between you and Tom." She rolled her eyes, a hint of irritation flashing across her face. "Oh, come on. Are you still hung up on that? It was just harmless fun. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of it." "Harmless?" I repeated, disbelief twisting in my gut. "Jessica, you were flirting with him, right in front of me. You kissed him." "It was on the cheek," she snapped, setting a plate down with a clatter. "You're acting like I committed some kind of crime." "It wasn't just a kiss, Jessica. It was everything, the way you looked at him, the way you laughed at his jokes, the way you ignored me like I wasn't even there." She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Maybe if you weren't so uptight, you'd have joined in the fun. Everyone else thought it was hilarious. You're the only one who seems to have a problem with it." I stared at her, stunned. The woman standing in front of me didn't resemble the Jessica I thought I knew. This was someone else, someone who didn't seem to care at all about how I felt, who dismissed my pain like it was an inconvenience. "Do you even care?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you care at all about how this made me feel?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping in exasperation. "Of course, I care, but I also think you're blowing this way out of proportion. It was a bit of harmless flirting, that's all. I don't understand why you can't just let it go." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my frustration in check. Maybe because it feels like I don't even know you anymore. The Jessica I married would never do something like this, and she definitely wouldn't act like it didn't matter. Her eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring up. People change, you know. Maybe it's you who hasn't changed. Maybe you're the one stuck in the past, unable to handle a little bit of harmless fun. Her words hit me like a slap. Was this her way of telling me she was bored, that our life together wasn't enough anymore? The possibility stung, filling me with a mix of anger and heartbreak. You know what? Maybe you're right, I said, feeling the finality of my words. Maybe I am stuck in the past. Because back then, I thought we had something worth respecting, something worth protecting. But now, I don't know. Jessica's expression shifted, a flicker of something, hurt, maybe, or regret, crossing her face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that same indifferent mask. If that's how you feel, then maybe we need a break from each other, she said, her voice cold. I stared at her, barely able to process the words. A break? Yeah, she said, turning away and heading toward the bedroom. Maybe some time apart will give you some perspective. She left me standing there, her words echoing in the silence. A break. The very thought of it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to call after her, to demand an explanation, to make her see how deeply she'd hurt me. But something held me back, a growing realization that maybe she didn't care as much as I thought she did. As I sat alone in the empty kitchen, I felt something inside me shift, hardening into a resolve I hadn't known I was capable of. If she wanted space, I'd give it to her. But I wasn't sure if either of us would be the same when, or if, we found our way back to each other. Days turned into weeks, and Jessica and I drifted further apart, each living like strangers under the same roof. We barely spoke, barely looked at each other, and it became painfully clear that the distance between us was growing with each passing day. I could feel something unraveling inside me, some final thread of trust snapping as I accepted the painful truth, whatever we'd once had was slipping away, and neither of us seemed willing to fight for it. Then, one evening, I came home to find Jessica sitting in the living room, an envelope in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her expression unreadable. We need to talk, she said, her tone soft but tense. She gestured to the envelope, which she handed to me. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it's time for us to be honest with each other. I took the envelope, a sense of dread curling in my stomach. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a draft of a separation agreement. My heart pounded as I scanned the document, the words blurring together as I struggled to absorb what was happening. So, that's it? I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. After everything, you want to end it like this? Jessica's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. I don't want this to be ugly, and I don't want us to hate each other. But the truth is, we're not the same people we used to be. Her words struck a nerve, and I felt a wave of anger rise up. Is this about Tom? I demanded, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Is he the reason you're doing this? She looked away, and her silence was all the answer I needed. So that's it, then? I said, my voice cracking. You're just going to walk away from everything we built together, for him? Jessica sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's not about him, not really. It's about us. We've both changed, and maybe we were just holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore. I shook my head, a hollow ache settling in my chest. Maybe you're right. Maybe we've both changed. But you didn't have to throw it all away like this. She looked down, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. I think this is for the best. We sat there in silence, the weight of our shared memories pressing down on us. I wanted to scream, to shout, to make her understand the pain she'd caused, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Whatever we'd had, it was already gone. A week later, Jessica moved out. The house felt hollow without her, the silence a constant reminder of everything we'd lost. Friends and family called, offering their sympathies, but their words felt empty. I was left with the memories, good and bad, and the realization that I'd been holding on to a love that had slipped away long before I'd noticed. As the months passed, I started to rebuild, slowly piecing my life back together. I learned to live with the scars Jessica had left behind, and over time, I found a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but maybe it was the one I needed. In the end, I learned that love isn't always enough to keep people together. Sometimes, it's just the cards you're dealt, and all you can do is play your hand the best you can.